to our webinar panel on the Argentine 2023 elections. I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Studies here. I am on leave, but Argentine politics always brings me back. I couldn't stay away. Boy, terrorism has an extraordinary ability to adapt and survive. Somebody should write a book about that. Before we start, I should note that this event today is being co-sponsored by Columbia University's Institute for Latin American Studies, ILAS. Thank you to ILAS and to the Dr. Class staff for your support today. As we do with our webinars, we will have questions at the end, and those of you who are online are free to submit questions at any point during the talk. We will get to as many of them as we can. Just go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. In addition, today's webinar is being taped. It'll eventually be uploaded on our YouTube channel. If you have an urgent need for if Vicky says something spectacular and you have an urgent need to get the taped version more quickly, just contact our staff.
It will also be uploaded in the ILAS web.
It'll probably be uploaded more quickly in ILAS than here, but it'll be uploaded well here. All right, two bits of context before we begin. First of all, as many of you know, this week is the 40th anniversary of Argentine democracy, which I think is really worth noting. That is far and away the longest period of uninterrupted democracy in Argentine history, and it's actually one of the longest periods of uninterrupted democracy in Latin American history. Really, only Costa Rica far exceeds that. So this is a really important moment. And for all of its flaws, Argentine democracy is the real thing. It's been a fully democratic regime for 4 decades. For those of you who don't know, I like to say it. Freedom House currently ranks Argentina 2 points ahead of the United States on its global freedom index. So this is a real democracy. Second thing that I just wanted to point out as context is that we are in a massive anti-incumbent wave in Latin America and really across the world. Public discontent with politicians, with parties, with governments is widespread across almost every country in Latin America. And this has led to massive opposition and anti-incumbent voting. Anyone here in the room remember the last time that an incumbent won a democratic election in Latin America? Leaving aside, I'm not calling Paraguay a democracy. Leave aside Paraguay. When's the last time an incumbent won in Latin America? A presidential election? Little later than that. Costa Rica, 2018. So the incumbent party. So 19 presidential elections in a row. 2018, incumbents or their chosen successors or the parties have been defeated. In Argentina, anti-incumbent sentiment is wide and deep. Government performance has been terrible. The economy has been awful, especially over the last decade. Inflation is now bordering on hyperinflation. So in this context, the incumbent finished first in this year's election. So Argentina always gives us stuff to discuss. To talk about the election, we brought in 3 of really the smartest, most interesting scholars of Argentine politics and Latin American politics that I know. I'm going to read their introductions in the order that they will speak, and their order is Ernesto Calvo, followed by Maria Victoria Murillo, followed by Ezequiel Gonzalez-Ocantos. Let me introduce them, and then we'll set them off. Ernesto Calvo is the director of the Interdisciplinary Lab for Computational Social Science and professor of politics at the University of Maryland. He works on a bunch of issues, including comparative institutions, political representation, social media, and social networks. He is author with Vicky Murillo of a fantastic book entitled Non-Policy Politics, Rich Voters, Poor Voters, and the Diversification of Electoral Strategies. That was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, is that right? He's also author of Legislative Success in Fragmented Congresses in Argentina. That was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. As well as Fake News, Burbujas, Trolls y Otros Encantos, Cómo Funcionan para Bien y para Mal las Redes Sociales, which was published by Siglo XXI in 2020. Ernesto has co-authored dozens of publications in Latin America and the United States, and has including several award-winning articles. Ernesto, thank you so much for joining us today. Our second speaker will be Maria Victoria Murillo. She is an old friend. She's a graduate of the government department a few years ago. She is professor of political science and the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia, and is widely known as one of the preeminent scholars of Latin American and comparative politics today. She is author of several books, including Labor Unions, Partisan Coalitions, and Market Reforms in Latin America. More recently, Political Competition, Partisanship, and Policymaking in the Reform of Latin American Public Utilities. She's co-author, as I noted earlier, with Ernesto of Non-Policy Politics, which is a terrific book on electoral strategies and clientelism, and also an outstanding book entitled Understanding Institutional Weakness, Power and Design in Latin American Institutions, which is co-authored with Dan Brinks and some other guy I can't remember. Finally, so thank you for coming back. Finally, Ezequiel Gonzalez-Ocantos is professor of comparative and judicial politics at Oxford University. He has very quickly emerged as one of the most important scholars in the region on judicial politics and transitional justice. He's author of Shifting Legal Visions, Judicial Change and Human Rights Trials in Latin America, as well as The Politics of Transitional Justice in Latin America, Power, Norms, and Capacity Building. Ezequiel, many thanks for joining us. So we begin with Ernesto Calvo.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. We have had quite a couple of elections since the PASO a month and a half ago. Let me just start by saying that if you had asked me what was going to be the ballotage about a year ago, I would have not assumed that Milei was going to be there or that he was going to be a viable candidate. So things have happened that defy what we were expecting of this election. About a year ago, I would have assumed that we would have had Juntos por el Cambio competing in the ballotage with a very significant advantage. And I would have assumed that Bullrich would have been shoo-in to become the next president of Argentina. Things have changed dramatically, and they have changed dramatically in ways that we were not expecting. And this happened, we could see that our biases about what would happen in Argentina were also observed in the surveys. In the surveys, we were under-measuring Milei, and we had been under-measuring Milei until now by about 5 points now. So I'll talk about that for a little bit. So first, let me indicate the three, for me, biggest challenges that Milei has brought to Argentine politics. And if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen. So Milei has done three things that were unanticipated. The first one of them is that we expected Milei, a very far-right candidate that had 2 days ago after the election, Eduardo Bolsonaro as part of the celebrations in his meeting, and with very significant ties to far-right groups in the US, in Latin America in general, in Brazil. We expected him to be taking votes primarily from Juntos por el Cambio. So we expected Argentina was going to have an election with the Peronism on the left, the Juntos por el Cambio coalition in the center-right, and then Milei coming with a significant lower vote share on the very far right of the political spectrum. To our surprise in the PASO, the first thing that we found out was that Milei was taking about the same share of votes from voters of Macri as he was taking votes from voters of Fernandez in the previous election. So the first surprise was that Milei was both capturing votes on the right and on the left, and that he was taking significant votes from the low-income voters in both the barrios, the shanty towns, and also from low-income voters in Argentina. This was, I mean, to some degree, that makes sense, as the income has declined dramatically, and that's perceived more heavily by Argentine voters with lowest income. But it's still, that shows that the resilience that we know from Peronism was less based on social class than what we had thought since 2015 till now. The other important thing that happened in the election of El Paso, and that repeat now, is that every party that has emerged in Argentina since the 1880s has first grown in the city of Buenos Aires, the province of Buenos Aires and Cordoba, and then has made inroads in the countryside. Different from that, Milei's largest vote shares in the Paso, and that's also true in the election yesterday, came from provinces in the Northeast, in the Northwest, and in the Patagonia. So it defies every type of growth that we've seen from the radicals in the 1890s, all the way to the Peronism in 1940s, to the Frepaso in the 1990s, and to the PRO in the 2000s. So Milei has been quite uncommon as a candidate. The third thing that is very important to keep in mind as we are moving along to how the vote unfolded in the last month and a half is that Milei's vote is overwhelmingly male and has over 50% of vote among voters 18 to 28. And the vote declines dramatically as we move to middle age and elderly. So from 35 to 65, the vote from Milei drops precipitously, although it still remains with very significant vote shares among men in over 40. So those three things are uncommon about Milei. Right after Paso, Milei was measuring 29% of the vote on the Paso. So when we finished the Paso, he was here. Immediately after the Paso, all the surveys measure a jump of about 10 points in Milei, which made us concerned that he was going to win in the first round. The boost that he received after the Paso by winning the election did not hold, and over time he started to climb from 38% to about 28% when we measured right before the election last week. Which is a drop of about 10 points from the Paso to the General. Now, we do have to consider that he obtained almost the same number of votes as in the Paso, but we also have to remember that the vote share, the percent of the population that voted increased by 15 points. So effectively, Milei has remained steady by increasing only by 15% of the vote in total, but without being able to capture votes from the other parties. At the same time, let me just clear this. At the same time, we have seen that the province of Buenos Aires, the Peronism was able to bounce back, and from being in a practical tie right after the Paso, Kicillof made significant inroads and was able to win the province not just by a small margin but conclusively, and that La Libertad Avanza came in third, considerably weaker than what we had expected after the Paso, which is also something to keep in mind as we move towards the ballotage, that we are very uncertain on to what extent both La Libertad Avanza is going to be able to hold to the votes of Cambiemos, and I'll show a bit of that in a second. When we consider the transfer from the Paso to the General, let me just clear this, which So everything is different here. When we consider the transfer from the Paso to the General, we have that Massa was able to hold on to almost all of the votes. 95% of the voters of the Paso of Massa were kept as Massa voters in the general election the other day, and 71% of the vote of Grabois, which was part of the coalition, was able to be kept inside. On the other hand, we see that Bullrich lost significant number of votes, and that the single most important transfer was to Milei, and the same happened with Larreta, with only 65% of the vote of Larreta stayed in the coalition, and almost half of the votes that went outside of the coalition went to Milei. That's actually good news for Massa, because it means that the votes that remains in Cambiemos is less likely to shift to Milei. We were anticipating that by the time we get to the ballotage, about 2/3 of the vote of Juntos por el Cambio was going to migrate to Milei, and Massa was only going to receive about 1/3. That meant that Massa needed to win by at least 7 to 8 points to be tied in the general election. But the fact that we see some significant migration from Paso to General just recently also means that there's fewer votes that need to be transferred from Cambiemos to Massa. Those 7 points might also have more weight than we expected, because we are starting to receive information that the shift from Cambiemos to blank vote might increase at a higher rate than what we expected. So that means that Massa is now competitive, and that we're going to have, today we have a dead heat runoff, but in the dead heat runoff, I think that the advantage that we expected for Milei is not as large as before. Again, we still need a lot of information about how the votes are going to break in the next few weeks. As I was saying, one of the most important things that we see in Milei vote is the difference between men, women, and age. So men are voting at significantly larger margins for Milei, and so are the young. We were concerned with this because if you think about political socialization, we have an entire generation that could be socialized on a Milei win. That would be, for us, very dramatic, because even if Milei goes down, in flames and the government collapse, which could happen, we still have voters that kind of committed to a vote that was a winning vote in this election. So a defeat of Milei in the second round for me is critical, because in a way that might ensure that the rise of the far right in Argentina is going to be less significant and short-lived compared to what we could see if Milei wins the presidency. Finally, as I was saying, we see the same gender gap and the same age gap in all the regions of the country. It is more dramatic in the gender gap is more dramatic in the province of Buenos Aires, the city of Buenos Aires, but the age gap is the same all over the country. So we have more of a vote for Milei in Patagonia, NOA, NEA, but at the same time, we do see that the social composition of the Milei vote is roughly similar. The other thing that we see is that gender gap is coming from all the political parties at kind of at the same rate. So the difference between the vote from men and women from those that voted Macri is as large as the difference between men and women of those that voted Fernandez and those that voted Lavagna, and so on. So it's not coming from Cambiemos, and the social composition of the vote extends across all previous votes in Argentina from 19, and also we checked with 21 and 15. Sorry, I think I heard echo. And then finally, because we have 12 minutes, we saw the same gap held before and after the Paso, with the jump that we have right immediately after the Paso, following the same gender gap composition and age that we had seen, with a significant increase in the intention to vote for Milei from before the Paso to after the Paso. Sorry, I actually was doing I was marking the wrong one. So we expect that that's also going to hold in the next in the runoff election. So we have that both the three key characteristics of the vote that helped Milei to become the runoff candidate were younger voters, male voters from the countryside. That defies the notion that this is a protest vote. We see a lot of enthusiasm and not just anger with the government. And in fact, the vote that is more intensely pro-Milei is not a vote that is particularly angry. It's a vote that is more enthusiastic. And as we move to people that are more frail and that are and whose assets have been liquidated to a larger extent, both people that are in the peak of their productivity age and where unemployment has made more significant inroads after employment, those voters have remained tied to more traditional options, and the non-traditional option is being preferred by voters that were not well integrated into the labor market and that were not particularly angry, but are very enthusiastic about some of the issues that are raised by Milei, including dollarization, the pro-gun stance, and the support for a reduction in state. So there's a very strong embrace of some of the programmatic proposals of Milei among the young and not among the middle-aged and elderly. So I'll stop so we can move to the other discussants, and I can bring some more data on what we have from the surveys later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. Next up, Maria Victoria.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks, Ernesto. Expert had a similar gender gap, I've noticed in your graphs, so that's something to consider. I'm not going to repeat what Ernesto said, and I'm just going to have some thought on what it means. We started this as an unexpected three-way race. We didn't expect Milei to do so well in the first round. And I think here there are two surprises. One is the absolute decline of Juntos por el Cambio. They were not even able to keep the votes from the primaries. I mean, this is a pretty bad performance. And they were only able to win in the city of Buenos Aires. They were not able to win in any other district. And this is particularly remarkable given that the Juntos por el Cambio has more governorships than any other political coalition. So in the non-concurrent elections that we've seen for provincial governors, they were doing very well. And in fact, they were able to take many important provinces from Peronism, like Santa Fe, like Chaco. So it's interesting to see the contrast between those elections and the presidential elections. And the second thing is Milei. He basically replaced, I think, Juntos por el Cambio as the focal point of the opposition. And I agree with Ernesto that the support he has in the interior is very significant, but he did better, I have to say, in provinces that were traditionally Juntos por el Cambio did well, right? He did very well in Córdoba, in Mendoza, in Santa Fe. So non-traditional Peronist provinces, in that sense, kind of taking the space that was previously occupied by Juntos por el Cambio. All of this with a very, very aggressive campaign, disorganized campaign, like he wasn't talking to any of his people. Everybody was saying something different. But where the core, I have to say, that the young follow is not just the policy issues that Ernesto mentioned, but also this anti-casta, right? The hate to the political class. I think that was very important. And it's relevant because he has completely shifted in the night of the election to basically a Bullrich-like discourse of anti-Kirchnerismo. And finally, Massa. Massa was the best candidate. I mean, for anybody who has seen the debate, it was pretty amazing how he presented himself as talking about the future and how this government failed and the future government would be much better given that he's the finance minister and effectively in charge of the government. despite the fact that inflation runs over 150%, there is a run on the dollar, there's 40% poverty, there have been recent corruption scandals that seem to give fodder to Milei's denounces of the political class. He not only won, but he won like more than 3 million votes between the primary and the first round of the general election. We expected him to be in the runoff, but not to be leading the runoff like this. And this was, again, the mobilization of the traditional Peronist vote. He won over 1 million votes in the conurbano bonaerense, in the belt around the city of Buenos Aires. The province of Buenos Aires was an extraordinary election for the Peronists. Not only did Axel Kicillof was re-elected with 45% of the votes, but a lot of the mayors were won by the Peronists. Juntos por el Cambio lost mayors to the Peronists. So they did very, very well. And again, in the interior, they did very well in these traditional Peronist provinces, strongholds like Santiago del Estero, Formosa, Tucumán, Chaco, where the Peronists had lost the governorship to Juntos por el Cambio, Catamarca, and again, you see a growth in the Patagonia. In a sense, both the increase in participation, the decrease in blank ballots, and the mobilization of the party machine seems to have been helping Massa to the point that we knew that this was the best strategy. You know, a divided opposition was the only way the government could win. But I think now he's getting into the runoff with a fair chance of winning, much larger than we expected. So 2015, we had a divided government and the opposition won. Here is kind of the reverse. We have a divided opposition, and that gives an advantage to the government. The other case where we've seen a little bit of this is the case recently, the case of Ecuador. Correa's candidates in the last two elections have won the first round and lost the second round. I think this is a little bit different from Ecuador, because in the case of Ecuador, there was no fear for the opposition to Correa. This looks more like Brazil in a sense, in the anti-petismo versus the anti-Bolsonarismo. There's two polarization, the traditional polarization of government versus opposition around Kirchnerism, and Milei is now trying to get those votes. I think the extent to which Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner continue keeping a low profile, that reduces the salience of that polarization, that case, although Cristina appeared yesterday in a public interview with Rafael Correa. So we'll see what will happen, especially now that there's no risk of losing the province of Buenos Aires. And the second, the new polarization that we're seeing is a polarization between democracy and right-wing populism. This is totally new for Argentina, although it's kind of going around the world. Milei broke the democratic consensus in what he says on human rights. He looked very careless, provoking a run on the dollar. He accused the Pope of supporting left-wing dictators. He accused Patricia Bullrich of killing kids as a guerrilla member or like a terrorist in the 1970s. I mean, he has done all sorts of strange things that make it hard for him in the second round. So in a sense, he is his worst enemy in terms of making this polarization cleavage more salient. It's hard now. He needs the votes of Juntos, but he has told the radicals that they are, you know, the worst, that he, for fun, fights against a doll with the face of President Alfonsín. He has not just rejected human rights violations, but used the arguments of the commanders in the trial. I mean, it's really breaking to the Catholics. He has made comments on the Pope. One of his candidates has said that Argentina should break relationships with the Vatican. I think this is the first time that we see the Archbishop of Buenos Aires telling people, don't forget your Bible when you go to vote. As Ernesto showed, there is a significant gender gap And I think he has all sorts of ideas that make women afraid, from the rejection of abortion, attack on feminism, there's no gender gap on wages, you can carry guns, you can sell organs for transplants, fathers can renounce paternity, and you keep going. So it's not so surprising the kind of things he says, that women do not want to vote for him. And even for the business sector, so in thinking of the comparison with Bolsonaro in 2018 had already said that Guedes will be his finance minister, and was like supported by the business community. But in the case of Argentina, the business community sided pretty strongly with Bullrich, and Milei's claims that he will break relationships with Argentina's main trading partners, Brazil and China, that he will go out of Mercosur and would not sign the EU-Mercosur agreement. All of these, not to mention that there's no clear economic program, and that he's not going to appoint, or whomever he appoints, he's going to be his own finance minister, do not generate a lot of confidence. So it's very hard for him. I mean, it should be easy. The opposition got the majority of votes. The economy is doing terrible. The performance of the government on many dimensions is very bad. So the opposition should have an easy time winning the runoff, but he is actually pretty good at making his own case against him on this other cleavage of democracy versus right-wing populism. And I think that's very important. I don't think Argentine voters are going to be defined by what leaders say. Now there is a lot of tension in Juntos por el Cambio about what to do in the future and whom to follow. And of course, the radicals are saying one thing, the pro is very divided. But I think what we saw through this year, and there were many rounds of elections, is that people in the same locale choose different for governor, sometimes for mayor, sometimes for president. So I don't think it's so easy. Politicians might say, I support or I don't support this candidate, as it's already happening. But I think voters are going to decide a lot on their own, and are going to choose not just between the two options, but I think there's going to be a significant blank ballot.
Thanks, Vicky. Third, Ezequiel.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me properly? Yeah.
Yes.
I have another sign of British decline. There we are. So yeah, I agree. This was quite an extraordinary for the things that you pointed out. We've seen this meteoric rise of a political outsider that had never really happened since in quite the same way. It's true that on Sunday, Milei slightly underperformed relative to the that followed his result in the past. But yes, his 30% of the vote is a novelty in the bigger scheme of things. And of course, the second thing of the candidate, as Vicky and Ernesto have alluded to. One has to remember that this is probably one of the stories of our united Peronism in first round presidential elections, but it's still, in my view, quite a feat given the circumstances that my colleagues have described. So we need to do some work to fully understand both of these things. I don't have answers. I have some thoughts. Commentators have pointed out that there were sort of two very salient emotions. One of them was anger at the political establishment, political class unable to govern the decade of decline, of no growth, of very high inflation. And along comes, Milei with his ruthless criticism of the political establishment. And he sort of manages to capture the imagination of some disillusioned voters, and Ernesto suggested, especially young males. This is obviously a classic populist cleaving strategy that people the political class. But I think the brilliance of this move, and it's important to understand the result, is that it completely destroyed the strategy mainstream party of opposition coalition, because it very effectively reduced, I think, the salience of the anti-Peronist, Kirchnerist master cleavage, if you want, of Argentine politics, on which the entire strategy, Juntos por el Cambio, since 2015 at least. And so for the last 2 years, I've been not quite as extensively as I've been surveys, and especially focus groups, to study affect towards these sort of three main political groups. And there are some things that I think help understand how this sort of worked, that this sort of new cleaving strategy from Milei. One thing we find is that the Juntos por el Cambio weakened quite quickly and quite significantly over the last 2 years, due to obviously the lack of leadership and within the coalition, but also, and I think this is more interesting, because voters, Juntos por el Cambio core began to perceive the Grieta differently from the way in which they had thought about the Grieta beforehand. This, was in part because of the coalition's failed presidency or failure in government, but also because of the appeal of this new narrative introduced by Milei. In a nutshell, sort of Juntos por el Cambio core supporters are no longer finding peace, the Grieta. So think about one of the hallmarks of effective polarization, right, is that you feel threatened by a rival group, but you also find a sense of belonging to your group. But rather than sort of seeing themselves as sort of well represented or safely as they had until very recently, these sort of voters began to describe themselves as actually through the crowd, trapped in the middle of a dispute of which they're not a part. The Grieta started to be perceived as a game by politicians, and at the end of the day, the Grieta no longer felt real, but actually a fabrication. And this is, by the way, the way in which Milei supporters talk about the Grieta. And all of this, I think, proved particularly damaging in combination with something else, which is that Juntos por el Cambio and Milei core supporters, at least in our surveys, share very, very similar preferences. So the libertarian brand is not something that repels them, as it were. The only differences are obviously, as Vicky suggested, age. Milei voters are younger. Gender, Milei voters are more male. And another thing we find is that there's more social optimism among Milei supporters than Juntos por el Cambio supporters. And these are, of course, the votes that Juntos por el Cambio followed. And we also test among these voters emotional reactions to different victory scenarios. And what we find, Juntos por el Cambio supporters are not particularly upset. They're not excited either, but they're not upset in the same way as other voters are by presidency. So all of these things helped erode the brand and make them less of a reliable core. So where does sort of Kirchnerism or Peronism stand in all of this? Well, what we find, or what I say, is that the brand remained robust during this period, at least among core supporters. It also had programmatic contours. And I think in part the brand remained stable because the way in which these voters talk about years of government suggests that they sort of deflect blame towards what they perceive as an outsider from the and so this minimizes disillusionment, if you want, with their own group and sort of keeps that brand afloat. And for them, Grieta is not a fabrication, it's real and it's programmatic. And so this, I guess, leads me to the second striking thing about Sunday, which came. And so if what I just said is more or less sort of plausible, then he had more solid roots on which to start building competitive plurality, if you want. And the way he did this is suggested activating the Peronist machine in places where the machine had been really lethargic in the Paso, to say the least. These regrouped more importantly, Massa was able to channel the other emotion that some people say was salient in this election, which is fear, right? And Vicky talked about fear of adjustment, fear of Milei's more outlandish proposals, fear of his limited commitment to democratic norms. And then he discussed a series of policies aimed at shielding or boosting the consumption power of traditional more than just sort of instant gratification, but actually raise the stakes of a sort of painful or radical adjustment policy. And so over the last few days, we've seen a debate about whether economic voting theories need to be thrown out of the window, or we should keep them just to what's happened in Argentina. And just to sort of intervene very briefly in that discussion, one could say, and I may be completely wrong here, but one could say that with these policies to make a virtue out of mismanagement, the message was, yes, I can mismanage the economy, but I can also protect you from that mismanagement. Others can't. And just to finish very quickly, I just want to say something about the future of Juntos por el Cambio, because I think that's important. It's important because it has implications for the stability of this sort of bi-coalition party system that we had until now. It also has implications for the kind of opposition a Massa administration, and I'm sort of suggesting the outcome, what a Massa administration would face and his governability options going forward, especially as one might be a man and distance himself from Kirchnerism. We've been hearing, as Vicky mentioned, a lot of debate about within the coalition. There's a split between the radicals who have more strong anti-Milei preferences and Macri and some of his lieutenants pro-Milei, anti-Massa preferences. Now, these tensions obviously won't be easy to resolve. They may be but it is obviously very different to lose an election as in 2019 with 41% of the vote than that you know, you can go next. It's very different from losing it catastrophically as they lost it and be left without any clear leadership. The case now. Sense is that if the sort of cooler heads prevail, and by that I mean the voices of members of the coalition with actually a political future, it should be obvious to them that I think they have strong reasons to try and remain, not take a position vis-a-vis the second round. Now, in their heads, right, you could think they're thinking, well, uncertainty about the result. Under those conditions, some of them might say, well, you know, I have the capacity outcome by turning myself for or against one of the candidates, and why not give that a shot? But my impression is that even if you think that because you have strong programmatic or ideological preferences, or because you really think that there's something at stake, precisely because the outcome is uncertain, then you may end up on the wrong side. And so I think the incentive there is to a world in which they're thinking perhaps a more realistic calculation, which suggests that Massa is likely to win. Under those conditions, preference for Massa should not lead you to support him, because of course that cheapens your support. It ultimately undermines your ability to be really a relevant ally or a relevant opposition to Massa, whatever your position is going to be. And I think being an effective Massa ought to be the main goal of the coalition if they behave rationally, right? A Massa presidency has a reason for rebuilding a competitive mainstream non-Peronist alternative, especially for those who stick pillars ahead of them. And this is the best case scenario because it's the best set of circumstances under which this group can try to sort of reapply a strategy that was actually quite effective for them in the past, which is to highlight this traditional divide between Peronism and anti-Peronism. And of course, to do that effectively in this election is what cost them the presidency. Now, this, of course, will be hard to the extent that Massa has to distance himself from Kirchnerism and will require much more political dexterity to reactivate that cleavage. But I think it's unclear that Massa will want to do this right away because of the kind of he's been able to given him the presidency, or that will give him the presidency. And it is also unclear, I think, that he will be able to distance himself from right, given the dreadful economic inheritance he will receive from himself. You know, he will need some result in order to repeat Kirchner's move against Dualde in 2005. So I think this scenario gives Juntos por el Cambio to go back to now. Whether cooler heads prevail is another story. I think the vanquished leaders of the coalition, those with no clear political will this. just to finish, so in my opinion, it would be a catastrophic failure of judgment, really, to go separate ways. I think Massa's room for maneuver will open up quite significantly. His governability options without a heavy reliance on Kirchner will increase, allowing him, just to mention another of Kirchner's moves in the early 2000s, perhaps to try to repeat the famous transversal that worked for in the first Kirchner government. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to lead off with a couple of quick questions, and then we'll take questions both from the audience here in Cambridge and out there in the interworld. A couple of quick questions. One mostly for Ernesto, but anyone who wants to can answer this. Ernesto, as you pointed out, it's really a puzzle that Milei did so well in the periphery, in part because that's not where new parties start historically in Argentina, and also because the ideological right historically has always done much better in the urban centers than in the periphery. So what accounts for Milei's success in the periphery? And he does extremely poorly in the city of Buenos Aires, for example. Secondly, if each of you could just say a couple words about the prospects for governing under both Milei and Massa. What should we expect? What are the biggest challenges that both the Milei and a Massa presidency would face? Why don't we go back in the original order, starting with Ernesto?
Thank you. And two great, interesting questions. The first one is, I think, still baffling. I mean, we do understand that there's different cleavages that we were mentioning, the gender cleavage, the age cleavage, and then the federal cleavage. At least with our colleagues, talking about this issue, I think we settle on one option that seems the one that has the most support, which is the very strong reaction against the centralization of Buenos Aires politics that had all the leading candidates. Of course, you can say that Milei is also a candidate coming from the metropolitan region, but at the same time, the anti-casta message, I think, in the countryside, in the provinces, it resonates even more also as an centralization, anti-metropolitan dominance in this current election. Provinces, I mean, the other way to read this is a reaction of the old Concordancia. For those that don't remember, the conservatives in the 19th century had a very strong national party that broke into a set of islands, conservative islands, that was known as the Concordancia, and that set of conservative provinces is what it seems to have been Milei to recoup. Conservative provinces that were, as Vicky mentioned, pro Cambiemos, but that were more angry towards the metropolitan area than expected. It's interesting that we're in places where Cambiemos had been a viable alternative that was anti-metropolitan region, provinces like Córdoba and Santa Fe, where Cambiemos had led some of the reaction against the 125, were also provinces where Milei did have weaker inroads, where Cambiemos was very strong and the Peronism, as a matter of fact, increased a bit compared to 21 and 2018. But the truth is that we don't have a clear response of why Milei was such an attractive candidate for provinces that had such traditional partisan attachments to both Cambiemos and the Peronism, even if the one Cambiemos was closer. On the second issue, very different trajectories, I think, for Massa and for Milei if they become government. And again, I think that I saw in one of the questions that Francis was mentioning, that I was optimistic about the future for Massa. And I wanted to stress that we are at a 50-50 chance, and we have two very likely scenarios. Milei, for me, can be as likely next president as Massa. But the truth is, if Milei becomes president, he has only about 15% of the House, less yet of the Senate, and he would not be be able to capture enough of Cambiemos to reach majority in either the Senate or the House, which means not only that Milei is going to be on a minority, but it's also going to be on a clash course with Congress. So I think that Milei is going to inherit a very frail fiscal situation, a state that is depleted of resources. We do have to consider that the change in the IVA, that Massa push as one of the last things that he did this, and we see a bump in the data when he returned, the VAT tax to voters. It's going to be very difficult to Milei to claim that that's going to be reinstated given his anti-state and anti-tax policy. So the Argentine state is going to be an extremely frail situation. He's not going to have control of the Senate or the House or any possibility of bargaining with them, no governorships. So for me, we're in a collision course between Milei and anything that is institutionally, politically stable in Argentina if he's elected as president. So everyone anticipates that governability is going to be impossible, that he's going to collapse. And I do think that that's a very strong possibility. With Massa, I actually think the opposite would happen, not because the situation in the economy in the state would be any different. He's going to have a bit of an issue in scaling back the VAT after he is the one that gave the exception during the campaign. But at the same time, if Cambiemos truly splits, if not formally, at least informally, it is likely that with the support of the radicals, he can reach a majority both in the House and in the Senate. It is likely that he would be working with the governors and with the mayors in the province of Buenos Aires. So politically, I think that Massa is going to have all that he needs to maintain governance. To what extent that can prevent Argentina from going down the cliff economically, that I have no idea. But it is not true that he has to work against the political system. Milei would work against the political system. So I do expect that with Milei, we would have a very clear clash. And I expect that with Massa, he would pretty much restore the situation of 2007, not 3, but 7, when coordination was possible, of course, without the economy being where it was in 2007.
Yeah, coordination is a lot more possible when you're going 9% a year.
Okay.
Vicky, you're up.
Yeah, so on the periphery, I haven't done the analysis as I just thought this as Ernesto talked. I think the reason why these provinces supported Juntos por el Cambio and Milei is the same. These are the kind of exporting provinces with extractive industries, provinces like, the Cuyo area, the Núcleo area. I mean, these are provinces that are paying more, I guess, to the treasury and are not getting in relative terms as much. So it's not surprising that they're unhappy with Buenos Aires and that they are unhappy with how things work. And I think they first showed their unhappiness by supporting Juntos, and now they are doing it by supporting Milei. And that's Ezequiel can talk about the story of Rivadavia to give an example firsthand. On governability, I agree with Ernesto. I think, there's a high level of electoral fragmentation and everybody would need to negotiate given the numbers, but it's going to be much easier for Massa than for Milei, not only because Milei has no governors, only 39 representatives and 8 senators, but also because we don't even know who these people are. He put those positions on sale, so some of them might jump immediately to be allies of Massa. Massa has the ability to bring the radicals. He's already had war with the radicals in the province of Jujuy. I think he would have also the ability of bring certain sections of the PRO, like close to Horacio Rodríguez Larreta. He would be able to talk with the governors. The governors of the Juntos 10, 5 of them are radicals, and of the 5 that are pro, 1 hasn't been totally elected yet in the city of Buenos Aires. 1 is actually a former Peronist that lost the primary with Rodríguez Sá and can easily go back to Peronism. So certainly I think he has more opportunities to do some negotiation. Like Kirchner started with 23% of the vote, so he's in a better position in that sense. But Menem is also something to look at in a context of low resources and economic adjustment. Menem was able to build coalitions with governors in Congress and using executive decrees when necessary. And one can imagine Massa having a similar trajectory to keep his governability. Although, as Ernesto said, he's giving himself a pretty tough legacy. So I'm not sure how successful he will be.
I'm imagining Massa with sideburns now.
Yeah.
Ezequiel.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So in terms of the Milei, the puzzle of Milei's success in the periphery, one thing I would add, or at least reinforces this idea that the decoupling of electoral calendars, I think helped him perform so well in the primaries, because it lowered the stakes that governors had in that primary election, and therefore there was no need for activating machines in the same way as it happened on Sunday. So I think that's one possibility. It doesn't explain why they vote for him, but at least it explains another condition of possibility for this bypassing of the normal sort of growth trajectory of third parties or party challengers in Argentina. With regards to governability, I mean, I fully agree that the Milei presidency would be a presidency of high levels of institutional conflict. But there are some things going for him, I suppose, if you want to be optimistic in that scenario. I think his platform may be a bit diffuse, but no one will be surprised if he comes up with a radical adjustment program. He won't have to explain this. People know what they're voting for. And this may allow him some room for maneuver. People would expect this if he wins. His voters would expect this if he wins, even though they don't perhaps quite expect what the real costs of that might be. I think he's also already shown some openness to pragmatism, not just now, but also before Sunday, striking deals with controversial figures that are not particularly good vote getters, but could be governability anchors, including some unpopular trade union leaders, although those alliances were quite fickle. He has been ruthless with the political caste, but he actually has been quite, has had very kind words for one brand of that political caste, which is Menemism, right? And so, it is not inconceivable that he might seek to govern with some parts of the old and whatever Peronist establishment. So there are, and also if he wins, the economy is very likely to deteriorate even more rapidly as sort of the markets begin to price in some of his most radical measures, which is what had been happening until Sunday. So by the time he's sworn in, perhaps a lot of the dirty work in terms of pressures on the currency would be sort of sorted out for him, right? So there might be some chance of it not being such a disaster, but I would agree that the most likely scenario is one of deep and acute institutional crisis. And for Massa, in my view, the main governability challenge will be, well, what do I do with Kirchnerism, right? Because obviously, if he does austerity, if he is forced to implement some form of austerity and a devaluation of the official exchange rate, then of course that's going to be tricky on that front. And I'm not sure those other sources of support that have been mentioned will be enough to compensate for it, especially if he needs to do that quickly. If he can do that sometime in the next 2 years, but right before the next elections, then maybe he can distance himself from Kirchnerism and avoid the trap that Fernandez fell into when he became president. So I would say that will be for Massa the main governability challenge. He's of course much more astute and politically savvy than the current president. So I would say that there's a higher chance he'll pull it off.
Great, thanks. I've got a bunch of questions online, but let me open the floor to those who made the trek to the office. Any questions?
That's fine.
Okay, so
Just a quick question to understand how public sector employment plays the role in this. If you think about the largest employers or sectors of employment outside of Buenos Aires, I tend to think primarily as the government and military. So I'm just curious to try to understand whether who your employer is plays a role in how you're voting. Especially here. So one, you can think about, obviously you're gonna vote, you might potentially vote for the person that is gonna have you keep your job, not eliminate your positions. On the other hand, given some of the most recent corruption scandals on party finance, you might be getting sick of the system and you might vote against it. So I don't know, I'm just curious about how you guys think about employment in relationship to your voting patterns.
I'll lump another question in, Fernando.
Ernesto and Vicky, you have the book you have, you say that Peronism has a policy advantage over the opposition because they managed well the economy in the past. So that was lost during this administration, wasn't it? But it's still the Peronism beat the opposition. So what do you think about this issue of the policy advantage of Peronism? If they will be able to hold that advantage?
And one more, Angela?
I'm curious about what you said, especially Ernesto, but all of you, about the profile of the electors. And I was considering who voted for Bolsonaro and who supported Bolsonaro for his 4 years. And so we have similarities, but also difference, especially I think in the case of Milei, you are saying that the youngest are voting for him. And in Bolsonaro case, we had the middle-aged man and voted for him. And so I would like to hear a little about that, but also about two other things that were important in Brazil. One was religion. So most of the hard supporters of Bolsonaro were connected to evangelical church. So that was something very important. And the second, that is true also for Trumpists here, is that most were white men. So I know that in Argentina, you do not have that racial cleavage as in Brazil and the US, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about that as well.
Okay, why don't we take whichever of those ones you feel best equipped to answer, go back in the same order. Ernesto?
Okay, so same order. Okay, so thank you for the questions. I'm not exactly sure that employers have any significant impact in this election. Unemployment has been a relevant factor if we think unemployment is higher among the young, but I don't think we have any evidence that unemployed versus employed young voters are behaving any differently. And I'm not exactly sure that we know what are the consequences for employment of Milei or Massa. I do think that the consequences for unemployment and for an employment shock are going to be higher in the case of Milei because of any retraction on government spending is going to produce a significant increase in unemployment. And but I have no idea what would be the effect on the election. So I don't have much to say about that. On the policy advantage of Peronism, the counterfactual would be fascinating. I mean, we ended up an administration of Macri that was very, it was very unstable, very complicated, and ended up with Argentina being pretty much in default and needing of a rescue. So I'm not sure the situation in which we're ending now is all that different. So I don't have a counterfactual to know if there's a policy advantage that vanish in the case of Peronism. I do think that there's a policy advantage when we consider the candidates, that Massa is perceived as a more reputable candidate, and that when we ask to what extent they perceive that he could manage the economy, or he could manage unemployment, or he could manage poverty, we have Massa with a significant advantage over the other two candidates. That was true both with Patricia Bullrich and with Milei. But we have no counterfactual to see how Juntos por el Cambio administration would have dealt with COVID and with a weakening fiscal situation. And although Peronists have not had a good administration, and that's an understatement, it is also true that we're talking about almost all incumbents losing in Latin America in the last few years, and both COVID and the declining fortunes of the economies of Latin America also have an effect. So I have no significant reason to think that that policy advantage has declined. But I have no reason to think that Fernandez has been particularly successful. On the profile of voters, I think that you give you mark two things that are absolutely clear and interesting. We have no evangelical extreme right in Argentina. The voters that are more evangelical are not voters that are necessarily shifting towards Milei. And Milei has been not just very conservative and as he called as a capitalist anarchist or anarcho-capitalist, but he's also been very secular in the campaign that he has driven. His vice president has both overtones that are a bit religious, and she has significantly highlighted stances on human rights that I think are at odds with most of the voters in Argentina. But the truth is that in general, the campaign of Milei is absolutely secular. It has no appeals that are to the evangelicals, and not just no appeals to Christians, given his conflict with the Pope and the way in which both the U.S. extreme right and the Argentine extreme right feel about the Pope. So this is a very interesting secular conservative young vote. Why the difference with Bolsonaro? Again, I have no idea. So I leave that to my colleagues, hopefully.
Vicky.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that some of these questions require kind of the surveys. We don't ask on race, right, Ernesto? Like that's a question we don't know the answer because we don't even ask. So on the policy advantage, I mean, the way I understood our argument is that the Peronists had an advantage to move around because of the organization. And in fact, Massa has made a very good use of the organization on Sunday. So he would have an easier time shifting to the right once elected. And that we will see soon. And that the opposition to Peronists had to run on policy because they didn't have an organization. And that's what Milei has done. In fact, what's interesting is that within Juntos, the organizational structure was more with Horacio Rodríguez Larreta, who was presenting a more centrist view than with Patricia Bullrich. But even there, I don't think that's so distinguishable. I think we will have to see how Massa deals if he's elected with his own presidency, and here to what extent the Peronist machine remains intact as well. He once divided the Peronist machine between 2013 and 2017. And I think there might be a question of conflict within other parts of Peronism, especially Kirchnerismo, right? Religion, I think it's a very different party system. The party system in Brazil is much more fragmented. It makes sense to have evangelical parties. They can make inroads at the state level. They can group later. You have coalition presidents that needs those small parties. there is no religious party in Argentina because of the way the political system works. You need like national party systems, and the religion has notably always been absent from electoral campaigns since 1983. We even had a Muslim president that converted, but nobody cared. What's interesting is this is the first election, to my memory, since '83, where the Catholic Church is playing a stronger role in terms of calling their followers to think before voting, which is, I guess, a response to Milei's attack of the Pope. And even the Pope gave an interview shortly before the election, talking about the false messiahs that appear in reference to Milei. So I think with that exception, I think evangelical churches have voters of all different types, and they cannot control the vote. So if they would side, it would just divide their churches.
Ezequiel.
Just very quickly, so this question about the extent to which economic voting, what do we do with that, right? And I'm not sure what I said in my presentation, you could hear that, but my impression is twofold. I think we could perhaps think that what is happening with economic voting, to an extent, I wouldn't say completely, in Argentina is similar to what happens often with corruption in some countries, which is that it becomes a constant as opposed to a variable. And so if you think that everyone's going to mismanage, right, then of course that ceases to be a sort of relevant concern, or a salient concern, or one that really defines the vote. It's just a possibility. But I also think that, as I said, that maybe Massa, what he did was to make a virtue of mismanagement, in the sense of saying, I can mismanage, but I can protect you from mismanagement in the short run. The other candidates cannot. And very quickly, with regards to the differences between the Milei and Bolsonaro supporters, we actually did surveys, exactly the same ones in both places. And we find very different profiles as you said, in Brazil. What matters is whether you're not evangelical, to an extent race, and to an extent class. In the case of Milei, is younger people, males, and whatnot. The one thing that they share in common is their attachment to conspiratorial thinking. So if you measure conspiratorial thinking, this is a predictor of both affect for Bolsonaro and affect for Milei.
Okay, 8 or 10 minutes left. There were a lot of questions coming online. I'm gonna harvest several of them and just fire them at you guys, and don't necessarily feel like you have to answer them all. Take the ones you want to, and take about 2.5 minutes each to answer them. Sorry that we're running out of time, and I apologize we could not get to all the questions. Here are a few though. First of all, do you all expect or believe, by Bullrich's claim, that 2/3 of the Bullrich vote will go to Milei? Is that an accurate prediction or not? Secondly, what are Massa's prospects for winning over business support, sort of like Lula Ahmed did in 2022? And that could be both for the election governing. Third, what the hell is the matter with Argentine polls? Or let me put that in. That was the question, wasn't phrased that way. But the question: Argentine pollsters have a pretty bad rap. Do they deserve that rap? And if so, why? Finally, little bit of a longer question. You can take it up or not. Ezequiel already took this up. Is the collapse of Juntos por el Cambio a foregone conclusion? Is this party destined for ruin, or is there a prospect for salvaging what seemed to be a pretty established center-right in Argentina? Once again, we'll start with Ernesto.
Thank you. So I'll do it quite fast. 2/3 for Milei from Cambiemos, likely. That's what we were measuring before. Now that we had about a bit of that transfer in the general election, might be closer to 60, maybe 55%, but yes, likely more from Cambiemos to Massa. And we don't know yet how many blank votes and null votes. That's going to factor also. So Massa, I think, is going to be able to collect a lot of business support. I think that, as several mentioned here, I think we're going to see a movement to the right, or at least a movement towards the center. And I think there are also strategic reasons to contain Kirchnerismo within his government. He's going to have to realign the party, and that, I think, means that he needs a direct clash with some of the policies of the Kirchnerismo. So that, I think, is coming. I think the polls don't deserve that rap, but it is true that a lot of the polls that are done more seriously and with higher investment do not come out. So, but let me just say something. We've been doing a poll with one of my colleagues, Marcelo Escolar. He's been one of the main providers of data for political parties. In the last 3 months, we collected 170,000 observations. So this is massive. It's about 1,500 observations a day. We still have Milei 5 points below where he should be. And we've done everything you can think of the data. So that's a discussion for a different time. It's extremely difficult to measure properly Milei. Everyone else comes right. But we have 5 points, 7 points from Milei that we expect to have in Bullrich. We have no idea why that happens. We've been doing everything we can to try to address that. And the survey has been done in 4 different telephone lines, online, in person. Everything has biases that are extremely difficult to manage with. And finally, I think Juntos will informally split, not the label, but I think that radicals are going to be working with Massa if he wins. If he doesn't, I think he's going to split, because if Milei wins, the most conservative side of the area close to Macri is going to shift towards Milei. So Juntos is going to split in both cases, but on different sides.
Thanks. Vicky?
Yeah, I mostly agree, I think, with what Ernesto said on the Bullrich vote. I think it would really depend on the campaigns now. Massa, on the campaigns that both are able to run, to the extent to which the votes will go to Milei or would be blank if the polarization, democracy, right-wing populism becomes more salient. So that's part of what's happening. Or if the Kirchnerismo, anti-Kirchnerismo cleavage becomes more salient, then there would be more votes going to Milei. But I think in particular, the radical vote would be in tension there, as I said before. Massa already has business support. The question is which business, right? Like, you know, he is very close to certain business. And in fact, the shares of those companies went up as soon as the result of the Sunday election emerged. So he has very, very close links to business, but the question again is which business and what are the implications for all the business in Argentina. I think on the Milei and the pollsters, it reminds me of Menem, we are old, 1995 vote, when nobody voted him and he nonetheless won. I think we're getting here, people are ashamed to admit their vote for Milei. And so that's what you're getting in the polls. Juntos por el Cambio, I think they are pretty much deemed to broke. Because you will have a minority president, whether it's Massa or Milei, the president will have a very, very big incentive to break Juntos by offering positions in Congress and by offering negotiation in Congress. If it's Milei, he has no option. He cannot even fill the cabinet, I have to say. I mean, he has very few people, so he would be in desperate need of pro technicians and technocrats. And if it's Massa, because of his internal power structure within Peronism, I think he would also need an external support to keep himself, not just for policy-making reasons, but also for coalition-making reasons.
Vicky, I think you're underestimating Milei's capacity to fill his cabinet. He's got his dogs. Isn't that where he gets
You can clone many dogs, and then all the cabinet is done.
Ezequiel, you're the
So
word.
with regards to the Bullrich vote, I think so. If programmatic preferences sort of play a role, they should a big chunk of it should go to Milei. And also, I mean, what we, as I said, what we find is that the core Juntos por el Cambio voter is actually not particularly alarmed by the idea of a Milei presidency. They're not excited, but they're not alarmed by it. So they wouldn't have this sort of a lot of sort of they would vote for him, I think, without a lot of without having a big problem with that. But I think there's also going to be a lot of blank ballots, especially those who have not yet transferred to Massa, from Larreta to Massa, as Ernesto showed, would probably, a big chunk of that will probably go to the blank or abstention. You know, with regards to the collapse of Juntos por el Cambio, you know, as I said in my presentation, I think the rational response is not to break, because that cheapens them, and because you know, for example, a Massa presidency gives them a chance of rebuilding by reactivating the Peronist, anti-Peronist cleavage, especially with a presidency that will find itself in very difficult circumstances and will need to negotiate a certain amount of things with them. But of course, I think the key issue to sort of to know whether or not it's going to break is which voices within the coalition have the upper hand. If it's the vanquished leaders, the ones whose political futures are very, very grim, and whose political careers are, you know, nearing the end, or those who actually have a future, governors, newly elected governors, some younger members of the parliamentary blocks, and so on and so forth. For them, for the latter group, it makes way more sense to maintain unity for the reasons I just suggested. For the other group, less so, as they can perhaps be more enticed by the spoils of either a Massa or Milei presidency.
Okay, thank you. I am unfortunately out of time. Before I close, let me just remind you that we have another similar styled panel discussion next week. Our Halloween presentation is a really, really important topic, crime, elections, and democracy in Latin America. That will be moderated by this brilliant guy to my right, Manuel. But please, that was a terrific, terrific discussion. I really want to thank Vicky Murillo, Ernesto Calvo, and Ezequiel Gonzalez-Ocantos for your time and sharing your wisdom. Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks, that was great. Next time in person.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I'm terribly sorry if I couldn't, if the sound was bad. I really didn't realize that. Sorry.
Me encanta tu acento en inglés igual. So British.
On that note,
Bye, guys.
Bye.